The Wellbeing Show. I've got a super guest this evening for us in the UK, but the morning it is for him. He's seeing us before he goes off and does a hard day's graft in his job. So kind of you to join us, Stu. I'll chat to you in a second. If you're sort of listening to this on a Wednesday evening in the UK, a Thursday morning in Australia, it's live. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Join in. We're streaming live on several platforms at the moment. So we're on Facebook Live. We're also on my YouTube channel. So we'll pick up comments there, or you can sort of send me a message on WhatsApp, +44 7506 319 745. That's +44 7506 319 745. It'd be lovely to hear from you. I'll sort of keep watching my phone every now and then, and if something interesting flashes up, I'll get you on. I'll make you a star. Anyway, enough of that. Hello, Stu. Welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good morning or good evening for you.
Morning is fine. It's Thursday morning where you are, isn't it? So
yes, a beautiful sunny summer morning here.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's right. It's summer and the morning and Thursday, whereas in London it's winter and the evening and Wednesday. So there you go. The marvels of modern technology. It's extraordinary, actually. That's one of the things about the pandemic, is that this has become normal, hasn't it, for us?
Yeah.
That we'll just connect with each other around the world, which is amazing to think of, actually. I sometimes try and think about, what was it like in the last pandemic, the 1918 flu? I just can't get my head around what that was like, you know? Just if we'd had to do all this nonsense and not be able to reach out to each other and have good broadband and stuff. I'm sure there are lots of people in the world that don't have that. I'm talking about me as a privileged, white, sort of wealthy enough bloke in a stable democracy, but I'm very grateful for that status. So how's it been? It's been 10 months since I saw you last, I think. You were just saying just before the show. How's it been? How's it been in Australia?
Well, pandemic-wise, it was pretty crazy, to be honest, because I don't know if you heard, but Melbourne apparently had the longest lockdown in the world, which went on and on and on, and so people were very relieved at that point, whenever it was, I guess 2 or 3 or 4 months, 3 months ago, when they decided that we had to acclimatize to COVID normal, and basically open up, because so many people were going bankrupt and not being able to operate their businesses, and there was so much mayhem in that regard. So, and that's where we've been for the last three months, really, which fortunately coincided with our summer. But the COVID numbers here, which I think is happening in other places in the world, has just gone through the roof. I mean, Australia was listed as a green country, and we were allowed to have access to fly anywhere and not have to quarantine just before that happened. And now we're on the banned list because we're not the banned list, but that, we can fly. I mean, flights have opened up again in Australia, which is a big relief as well. But we do have to quarantine to different places we go to. I think a lot of people are relieved that, hospitality's opened up and businesses have opened up, and, those people that were able to hold on to their businesses have been able to save them. But, what I notice is a lot of for lease signs up in buildings in my city, and when I go down to Melbourne, and I think that it's had a massive impact on small businesses and things like that, which is very sad.
Yeah. Yes. And your neighbours really are the sort of Asian Pacific countries, aren't they? So they've also pursued a zero COVID sort of policies that I think Australia was pursuing before, but have realised it doesn't work, and have now gone, all right, go and get infected in a safe way with vaccinations and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's the other difference from the last time I spoke to you as well, is that we've had the vaccinations and the vaccination push, and Australia, I think, felt that at some point we were behind the rest of the world with vaccinations. So they did a massive push. And now we're up at 95% fully vaccinated, which is great. And so that was a big reason for opening up. And, there are I mean, just my mum and dad this week have both been COVID positive, and they're recovering quite well. And so but everyone on my Facebook page and, all around me, I mean, I've just been really fortunate. I just keep thinking, is it today that I'm going to get COVID? Because everyone around me is going down and getting it. And, but I mean, I'm not,
To be
I
honest,
know
I've
that
had it twice. The first time it knocked the pants off me, I have to say. But this second time, I don't know if it's because it's the Omicron or it's because of the vaccinations and the boosters, but it was nothing, to be honest.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was it. I know it was COVID because I tested myself for it, and so seems to have worked as far as I can tell. I feel pretty confident now about opening up and things getting on, and and all that. How do you feel personally about it, rather than the sort of broad picture?
Well, that's an interesting question, because personally, COVID was very good to me professionally in a way, because I came back to Australia because of COVID from overseas and landed a job being a team leader in a treatment facility in this town pretty much immediately. And my goal was to stay in Australia until I could transfer to Germany to, I want to do a master's in social work there. But in order to pay for university there and support myself for 2 years, I needed a certain amount of money to do that. And getting this job allowed me to do that. And the government sort of gave us access to our superannuation. And so suddenly that dream of mine became a reality. Right. And it only happened because of COVID in a way. And also for this last almost 2 years, I've been working in this treatment facility and recently become the manager. And so I've had so many learning opportunities, whereas normally I sort of operate solely as a therapist and doing one-to-one therapy and group work. I've sort of moved into team leader and then manager. And so the learning curves for me have been extreme over which I, like if someone said to me, wasn't it a waste of 2 years? I would say, well, just quietly, for me, it was incredible. I saved the money I needed to do to get overseas. I learned how to be a team leader and to be a manager. And, I ran my private practice for a huge amount of people who were, everyone, all the therapists here are sort of got waiting lists. So, it's turned out for me personally and professionally to be a positive thing in a way, even though it's quite tragic for a lot of people in other ways.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I mean, I think that's a similar across the board picture. There are some people that have benefited and worked on those benefits and worked for them. Obviously, people have lost loved ones, and that's dreadful. And some people, this experience has been probably nothing short of traumatic, actually. I mean, I would say. So there are some people, which I guess we're going to come on to and talk clinically. I know you from way back when you were setting up specialist projects out in Thailand for treating addiction for LGBTQI communities. Is that the full list of letters that go on that now?
Yes, that's enough for now.
That's enough for now. But then you've moved into the broader spectrum of sort of addiction and trauma work, as you say, during the so we billed you as an addictions therapist, so for the purpose of promoting the show. Tell me what that is. You bill yourself, I see on things like your LinkedIn profile, you're saying you're a clinical psychotherapist. So let's start with that. Who is Stu Fenton, the clinical psychotherapist, and how did that come about?
So I found myself with an addiction issue about 20 years ago, around 2000, and I was using recreational drugs and crystal meth and GHB, and really having a tough time, and also that all sort of began with a romantic relationship that I'd had that I wasn't able to deal with, and so I ended up in rehab for most of 2003. And then when I came out of that experience and, got sober, I was a school teacher at that point, and I decided that didn't really want to go back into teaching. And I was kind of so in awe of the therapists that were in my treatment facility. I just remember thinking, gosh, I would really love to be a therapist and an addictions counselor. But I just thought, oh, but who am I to think that I could do that? And I guess I spent the first year of my sobriety and recovery, just trying to make sure I didn't relapse. And then after a year, I went, yeah, you know what? I'll give it a go. If I don't do well at this, at least I will have kind of learned stuff about myself and about helping other people. And I got into it, and I did a graduate diploma in counselling at the Australian College of Applied Psychology, and I just loved it. I found that it just enriched my whole personal recovery so much by learning about conflict resolution and anger management and communication and all these areas in my life that I'd never really kind of focused on. So, from there I went on and did a master's in Gestalt therapy, because I'd sort of fallen in love with Gestalt. I'd had a Gestalt therapist in rehab, and then continued to do a whole lot of workshops and worked in a private hospital in Sydney, and then worked in a therapeutic community for 6 years up in Sydney as well. And I guess and then shortly after that, I was sort of certified that I could see clients one-to-one in a private practice. So I started that in 2008. So I guess my foray into being a psychotherapist really did begin in the mainstream, with mainstream people and drug addiction and alcoholism. And but then when I opened my private,
immediately train as an addictions therapist specialist at that point. You kept training broad. Was that a conscious?
Yeah, I did train broad, but I mean, at the beginning I thought, I just want to get my foot in the door and I just want to work in a rehab. And I didn't, in Australia, most people do the basic qualification to do that, which is a certificate or a diploma in AOD. And I didn't want to do the basic. I wanted something a bit more chunky, but I didn't want to do, psychology or anything.
Yeah.
So that's why I did the graduate diploma in counselling, and I majored in group work, AOD and self-esteem. And that did get my foot in the door, but that's when I kind of discovered Gestalt and that they were offering a master's in Gestalt in Sydney. So I guess I started broad and really just with a focus on addictions. I knew I enjoyed group works and I really wanted to find a way into doing that. I guess because I'd been a school teacher and sort of had in a sort of way, working with classrooms is group work. And so I knew vaguely that was the direction I wanted to go in. And then with Gestalt is such a relational and sort of warm, empathic way of communicating with people. And, because my experiences on the other end of Gestalt had been so powerful, I thought, okay, looking back, I can say this, I didn't know it at the time. I was like, okay, this is the road I want to go down. I don't want to be a blank screen, and I don't want to not be able to be relational or not disclose to the people I'm working with. So I started to go down that road. But at the same time, when I opened up my, I'm sorry, just one second.
Go get your phone.
I'm on call, sorry. But that's okay.
No, I totally understand. I am as well. I have various patients I'm on call to, and they can call at any time. So no, it's cool. It's a live show. This is
okay.
It's fine.
Okay, so and then I really wanted to get into working with LGBTIQ people, because that's what I knew.
A little bit before you jump into that. I'm interested. The reason I asked the question is because I'm always getting people asking me, what should I do this training? Should I do that training? Because I'm well known, I've got a good profile. And my sort of personal and professional approach is always to say to people, don't narrow your training at the beginning. Start broad, start really broad, and go and sort of get to learn the field. Because there are so many people, I think, who, they get recovery, like you, they get inspired by the experiences of the therapists that they see, and then they go off and they train as addictions therapists, and that's fine. But I often challenge people and say, well, you can go and add that on as a specialism, but first get to know the field, because I started in a broad field and then moved into the addiction work because I got interested in it and for personal reasons as well. Just very brief, AOD is addiction and associated disorders. Is that what it means, AOD?
AOD is addiction and other drugs.
Okay.
So
Right. Okay.
yeah,
Just
but I,
down to me. I'd like to, if you don't mind, just sort of ask for more information about Gestalt, which I think people might be interested in, and sort of what you found. Because I think of Gestalt as, again, as this relational, empathic, warm approach, but very much as well about groups. And there are lots of Gestalt, like the empty chair and those things, those techniques that Gestalt uses, which have moved over into things like drama therapy and psychodrama and other active forms of therapy. Do you mind talking a little bit about Gestalt and what it's all about so that people can understand it a bit more?
For sure. I mean, I think Gestalt was initially made really famous by Fritz Perls, who kind of has a reputation for not being so warm and empathic. I mean, he was very challenging and had a very different style. And I think there was a shift towards the more warm and empathic style of Gestalt a few years ago, maybe in the 80s or something. But you know, it's built on 3 pillars. One is phenomenology, another one is the dialogic relationship, and the other one is experiment, which is what you just referred to. And probably the dialogic relationship is sort of the focus of how you and I are operating in the room together, or what our relationship is like. What are the blocks to contact or the resistances to working through issues, and you know, a big part of it is exploring those resistances. With phenomenology, that's the phenomenology of the person. So we're looking at the repetition of words, or the kind of words they use, or it could be their mannerisms, or it could be the patterns. You know, like a lot of people say that the actual direct translation of Gestalt from German to English is patterns. So looking for the patterns, and also understanding that there are many different parts to a human being. Yeah. You know, all those parts together make up the whole. And that's, some people say that's the direct definition of Gestalt, German to English, is wholeness, you know, and that is the definition that fits really well with me, because when I was sort of at my worst at the end of my addiction, I did feel like all the parts of myself had kind of fractured, and my therapy was about picking up each part and putting myself back together to become whole again. So that's sort of how I really gelled with it. So phenomenology is looking at all the different aspects of the person and how they present to us. They have a beautiful, there's a beautiful phrase in Gestalt that's called looking at how the person bodies forth in the world, yeah. Which means, like, you know, I love to do this if I'm in public or if I'm in the rehab, is watching how a person walks from A to B, or how, and you know, do they get caught talking to people, or do they kind of limp, or do they lean to the side, and all this sort of stuff. All these little clues are the phenomenology of the person that give us information about who that person is. And then the last pillar is the experiment, which is probably the one that I first connected with in Gestalt, and the one that I love the most. When I was in treatment, I had a Gestalt therapist, and you know, probably 2 or 3 months into treatment, she started to do chair work with me, which I didn't know what it was at the time, you know, like I had no idea about any of this. And she did, I mean, it's actually funny when I think about it, because these were my first experiences of psychotherapy, and they have actually become the 2 really big areas which I incorporate in my work: chair work, Gestalt, but also inner child work. So she did chair work with me, having a conversation with my adult self with my inner child, and oh my god, it just blew the socks off me. I was in tears, and there was snot, and I was just like very impacted in a really positive way about connecting with that part of myself. But that's probably an indication of a slight example of what chair work is. Chair work can be much more than that, though. You know, you can have a conversation with, you know, your boss at work about, you know, the difficulties you're having, to explore different approaches you might take. So I guess that's a fairly simple overview of Gestalt that focuses on those 3 main areas.
I think what's interesting, I mean, think about where it comes from. and particularly the phenomenology, which takes the broader picture of the broader person and can incorporate, in my understanding, cultural issues and political issues and all sorts of stuff that people might be bringing in as themselves in the moment. And that was where the big divergence with Gestalt came from the psychoanalytic traditions, which were very much about the interpersonal relationship and the dyad and what that brought up about early childhood issues, and certainly from the old Freudian model, what you'd been imprinted with or born with genetically in some ways. But the relational model does have limits, I think, as well. And one of the things I like about Gestalt is that you can move just beyond that relationship into other issues. And particularly with that active chair work, you begin to realize and concretize some of those internal dialogues that we're all having. And I think that sense of being in bits is, I think, an emotional thing that people can empathize with a lot. I mean, it's the world that we live in. We can end up in bits, can't we? In bits of ourselves all over the place, and sort of having, do you do, I mean, it's, I think one of the sort of things that has, I mean, I think in therapy, one of the things that happens is we go through these cycles and things go forward and backwards and they turn like this. And at the moment, there's a big thing around internal family systems, which I think is about those bits, the experience of being in bits. I don't know if you've come across IFS much.
Oh, totally. I'm actually really excited and interested in it, and I've been exploring it lately. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to fit. I mean, I think it fits into that Gestalt model as well, very comfortably. And it's sort of, in many ways, that's how we experience ourselves. And I'm thinking about some of the early art therapy stuff, like, for example, collages never existed prior to World War I. And the only collage and art form only came out post World War I, because that's literally what happened. If you look at some of the battlefields, they are a collage. You have bits of this and that, and very bizarre images, and I think in many ways we experience ourselves in that sort of sense of trauma. So you do this training, you're a psychotherapist, you move up into psychotherapist, and you go into general practice straight away, or did you then focus immediately on addictions? And
well, I think in my private practice, I really, because I was so new, I was just wanting to stay close to my own experience. So when I began seeing private clients, I mostly worked with gay men. And I can remember, like, my first client was actually someone who came to me to talk about their work issues. I don't think it was actually even related to addiction, but it was just a really good first experience to start practicing, really. And I started my private practice the very first year I started my master's in Gestalt. So I was qualified from my previous qualification to see clients, but it was actually the most perfect learning opportunity, because those first 4 years of my private practice was the first 4 years of my master's in Gestalt. So everything I was learning in Gestalt, I was bringing in and being experimental with the clients. So, you know, if we did a section on dreams and how Gestalt therapists work with dreams, and someone brought a dream into a group, I'd be like, wow, okay, let's do this. And you know, it was, or metaphors or any of that kind of stuff that Gestalt can work with so beautifully. So I guess I did mostly start working with gay men for that part. But then what happened was I did sort of start billing myself as an addictions therapist. So I started to get people coming to me for addictions as well. And I was also working part-time in a private hospital where, you know, if I had a good connection with someone, they would ask, oh, can I come and see you for therapy outside of here? So in a way, I started I started to build a bit of a reputation, and so people would come and see me outside of the facility. And I would say I was working in my private practice by then equal parts addictions as well as LGBTIQ issues, mainly gay men's issues. But the other interesting part was, I told you earlier, I came into addiction because I'd had a romantic relationship that didn't go well. Mm. And I also discovered in my early recovery that I identified as a love addict, and in 12-step, you know, they have a fellowship for that, which is called SLA. And through that, I realized, oh, well, I think my primary addiction is actually love addiction, which led to me using drugs to cope with my love addiction. And so then I started to work with love addicts and love avoidance and codependence, because what I realized was a lot of my own issues had really emerged out of my codependent family system. And so I got very excited and passionate about working about that. And it was only later, really, like 13 or 14 years into being a therapist, that I got interested in working with sex addiction as well. So these days are the main areas that I'm still working with, all those areas, just that I've added sex addiction onto that list of other areas.
So we may come back. I might circle us back to what it's like to grow up being gay in Australia, of a particular generation. I'm sure it's different now to when you were growing up, and you're quite a bit grown up these days and quite mature, but I'm not over the hill or anything like that. But I'm sort of, again, I guess because I'm interested in these questions, sort of, you mentioned 12-step, and there is a form of therapy which merges psychotherapy and 12 steps. I mean, it's called the Minnesota model, which is the sort of main standard model in the US, and for some reason has been adopted elsewhere. And sort of, we could have a conversation about that. I'm interested because I guess mostly people go into addiction training, that's what they're going to be given, is the Minnesota model. And I have questions about it because I'm not sure that there's much evidence that it's very successful as a model, but that's maybe me. I'm interested in your view on it as somebody who comes into the field of addiction treatment, as somebody who's already got a qualification as a psychotherapist out there, and what your experience of that is and your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I love this question, actually. We haven't discussed this before, and it is something that I talk about frequently in my sort of area. And that is because, you know, like I went through a therapeutic community, like just to give a quick overview, like with rehabilitation and treatment facilities, there are different approaches or different models. One is therapeutic community, one is Minnesota model. You have hospital settings. They're really the three main treatment styles that I've kind of worked mostly with. And therapeutic community is a very specific model that is about, you know, a community living together and different phases of the program, and more privileges as they move through the system, more responsibility. Usually you don't have one-on-one counselling or therapy in this sort of model, but there is a lot of group work. Now, I actually do really believe the Minnesota model is very effective. And, you know, I've worked probably in as many therapeutic communities as I have Minnesota model style places. And I think that with the Minnesota model, maybe it's just a little bit misunderstood, because you're basically incorporating a lot of 12-step and going to 12-step, but it also does include a lot of group work, and it can have one-to-one therapy involved with it as well. It's quite dynamic. We have a few Minnesota model style rehabs down here, and actually I would say the most effective one, Malvern Private down in Melbourne, is a very dynamic Minnesota model style, and, you know, where they're taking people to meetings, but they're also incorporating the 12-step ideas in the groups and the process groups. But I think these days things have evolved a lot more, so that they're probably not as simple as they were when they were first created in the 50s or whatever. So that, you know, you do get one-to-one therapy, you do get sort of interpersonal style process groups, and you do get 12-step meetings, and you do get people talking about their life story, and you also get yoga and gym and recreation. There is so much involved there. It's very holistic, as well as having nurses, you know, like sometimes involved in that process, and doctors and psychiatrists. So I think the Minnesota model of today is very powerful, and but of course it doesn't suit everyone, you know, like obviously people are leaving there as well.
Yeah, I mean, the figures in the UK, it works for about 12% of people. which is okay. I mean, that's good. 12% is not bad. In terms of the devastation of this, but it's not sort of in terms of the general sort of population, not really exposed to that model in the UK. They tend to be exposed to other models which are based upon things like CBT and other sort of evidence-based practices that exist, which is a sort of standard thing. I think in the private sector more, it tends to have the sort of Minnesota model, but you know, it's about 96% of addicts in the UK I don't go through that sort of treatment model. Although there has been some studies now that certainly support the assertive outreach approach in terms of sort of linking people assertively into peer support groups. But the studies that have been done in the UK equally validate the 12-step and also the SMART recovery models. So I guess it's sort of looking at that and that sort of the growth of those support networks and the sort of how they might become. I mean, I say that as somebody who's in 12-step recovery, and I'm very grateful for it. It saved my ass, so I'm certainly not putting it down. But as a clinician, I like to try and think broader, and I'm aware I'm lucky in the sense that it does work. I'm one of the lucky ones it works for.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that harm reduction has become a very powerful approach to addiction, and I noticed that when I was, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
We're talking about Minnesota model, which you've then picked up on. You're bringing out the models. I mean, for people who don't know, 12-step is based upon the idea of abstinence when it comes to drinking and drugs and stuff like that. Abstinence is a slightly more complicated issue when it comes to food and sex and all of that.
Yeah. So when I was over in Europe and I was doing the Chem Sex forums and whatever, I became really aware that they were very heavily harm reduction based. And
I think in Europe, that's right. It is much more.
Yeah. And I mean, it is in Australia as well, but I think the thing is that there is a certain amount of people who just simply need abstinence, and those are the ones that really go well with Minnesota model and 12-step. And there are some people who go really well with harm reduction. And I think what I've become really good at in my career is knowing when a person needs abstinence and when they need harm reduction, because if someone is able to manage their drug or alcohol use without abstinence, of course, you know, let them try that and go for it. But usually if I'm working with someone for a period of time with harm reduction and they're banging their head against the wall and having multiple relapses and really harming themselves, then I will say, let's try this other approach. And I think that's, I mean, this is I don't know if it's an original thought of mine that I've always had, but I think one of the issues in Australia, because we have such a powerful harm reduction approach, is and I mean, this could be a bit of a blanket statement, but I think that sometimes a lot of psychotherapists and workers think that everyone should be able to achieve moderating or regulating their drug use, which simply isn't true.
No, it's not at all. That's right.
No. And I think, and so like I've learned, I was very much at the beginning of my career, like abstinence is the only way. And I learned the hard way that that's not true either. And so what I've done is become very flexible and adaptable and gone, okay, let's work and see where you need to be. And then once you're there, I'll give you all the support you need to be there. Yeah. And I think the reason sometimes why Minnesota model can get a bad rap is sometimes you get people who need harm reduction going in there and they just don't gel with it, or they don't like it. And so they need to go off and find harm reduction therapists.
I don't want to get caught up on it too much. I mean, it's just, I suppose the basic point is we need broad, open-minded approaches that are looking at both people's lived experience as well as the studies. I mean, and at the moment, it's difficult to find a space in which people are communicating on that level, because I think one of the real strengths of things like the Minnesota model or approaches based upon learning from peer experience, the real strength is the peer experience, is that people can find a voice to say, this is my experience of this, and this is what works for me, and they can have that dialogue and be empowered within that approach, I think. And clinicians who might keep a distance from that There's another maybe interesting question, which I'm sure you've grappled with as well, which is that sort of, is it healthy to have people working in a field who've got direct experience of it, and that's embedded in what they're doing? Is that necessary? Is it healthy? What are the checks and balances? I tell you why, I was chatting with a mate who actually is in recovery, and talking about their partner. Now, he's been in recovery a while, and I said, well, how's it going with your partner? And they were talking about it, and I said, and do they want to go and do any of that stuff around looking at what their experience was? And their partner said something interesting. Said, no, I'm not going to go anywhere near that. All of you are in recovery. You're all friends together. You're all in each other's pockets, which was, I don't know it's a true statement, but it's an interesting statement. And sometimes that is an issue that comes up from, say, when I work in the NHS, for example, where people are more reserved about their own personal experience and whether they bring that into and see it as relevant or not. What's your thinking about it now, Stuart, in terms of that stuff, both in the gay male stuff and that community, but also in the addiction recovery? And sort of, where would you place yourself on that?
Bringing my own personal experiences into the dialogue or with the
also, is it necessary to have a personal experience to be effective in the field?
Oh, okay, got you. Okay. No, I don't think it is necessary to be effective. I mean, I remember the first treatment facility I was in, all the residents knew who was a recovering addict and who wasn't on the staff team. And, you know, there were people who were not from that background who we thought were incredible and amazing and wonderful. And then sometimes there were people with a lived experience who we thought were terrible, you know. So I don't think that that's necessary at all. I think that there's lots of things we could talk about here. I think that one thing that's really important is learning how to regulate your disclosure, you know, of your experiences, so that it remains, the focus is on the person or the client, because some people get a bit carried away, you know, especially people who have just come out of their own addiction and only, you know, are 1 or 2 years sober working in the field, you know, get a little bit bogged down in their own story and, you know, abandon the client. And the focus has always got to be on the client with disclosure. You know, it should only be done in the interest of them, as you know.
Yeah.
But so, like, I think that what happens when you're a skilled worker is you learn how to, you know, refer to those experiences you've had in a productive way, but then turn it back to the client and say, the reason I'm telling you this is because, or, you know, I would hope this might be helpful for you because of what you've just told me. So,
yes.
I think that, but also I've worked with many people who've not come from addiction or a mental health dilemma, and they've been wonderful workers. So I definitely think it's really not relevant to be a great worker in the field.
Is lived experience in and of itself ever enough, do you think, to clinically work? Or I mean, I'm raising the issue because there is an issue about people who do come into the addiction treatment field in particular who don't have qualifications but only have lived experience, for example.
Well, you know, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Australia, that doesn't fly anymore. It used to until probably 15, 16 years ago, but then everyone has to have a qualification now, even if it is the most basic. I think that I personally think it's absolutely important that people with lived experience go off and study and get as much information as possible. Sorry, not just information, but tools and strategies and approaches, because sometimes lived experience, like, I think one of the biggest issues when it's lived experience is that a person thinks that their way is the only way. Or, for example, you know, like, I went through AA and I worked the steps, and so when they're working in the facility, that's what they're telling the client, but that's actually not necessarily going to be the best thing for them. You know, I think it's important to learn skills whereby you're able to use motivational interviewing and get a real sense of what that person actually needs. As we were talking about before, it might be really evident that person needs harm reduction. So someone coming from a very sort of directive AA background, talk to your sponsor and just do more meetings sort of thing, is just not going to work for that client. So I think doing a lot of study gives you a better ability just to have very generic counselling skills for a start, but it also hopefully would get you to a point where you're able to be flexible in your thinking and be able to say to someone, okay, well, to be able to identify what that person needs. And then, especially if you're not able to support that person, refer them to someone else. I mean, you know, where I'm at in my career today, like if I'm talking to someone on a first off phone call and I'm very clear, I mean, that there's one or two issues they're talking about that are just not my field, I'm always happy to refer them to someone I think will be better for them. And I think that's important to be able to do that.
I think it's interesting because one of the things I saw really early in my career, I sort of worked on institutional closures. So people who've been in long stay hospitals for no discernibly positive reason, who are going back to community homes. And you would see in these institutions cultures build up of generations of people who knew each other, often family members, but not necessarily family members, who had just learned bad habits from each other and weren't open to having them change because they had a personal relationship to somebody rather than a professional relationship. And I agree with you. I think what happens when you get some training is that you can begin to have a perspective on yourself at the very minimum. And once you can have a perspective on yourself, then you're open to learning and having differences happen. Whereas when you are just yourself, just experiencing yourself and trying to charismatically pull somebody along in the wake of, you know, them, the relationship with them, that can work. You know, I mean, you can charismatically pull people through trauma and addiction, etc., into somewhere healthier. So I'm not knocking that, you know, in terms of peer groups, that's what they do. You know, identification, that's the whole point about it. You find somebody that you identify with who's got what you want, and then they charismatically lead you out of the shit to somewhere nice, right? That's great. But, you know, the peer support groups are big enough so that you can probably find the person that you need, whereas the professional groups aren't as big as that, really, and there isn't that sort of choice and options. So I'm with you. Unfortunately, in the UK and in Europe, people can get away with not having qualifications in the field, and it is a significant and serious problem. It's good to hear that in Australia you're way ahead of us, so well done. Australia, good, and throwing out tennis players as well, so well done Australia for that. Got to bring that one in somewhere, haven't I? So come back to that later. So I mean, it's interesting. I think it is useful because I think what you're demonstrating for me is the capacity of a having reflective practice as a professional. And that's the key thing, I think, is that it teaches us these skills around being able to reflect upon what we're doing, listen and learn, not just from the patient, but from other people in our sort of professional network, and go, well, I don't think I've got that right. Let me go and find somebody who does know how to get it right. And that's correct. And so this is, you know, here's your journey. You're now, I think, as you say, you've moved into the public sector rehab industry. You're learning lots of sort of really useful skills, which you're planning to bring to Europe. So, well, hey, Europe, we get you back, which is great. Can't wait for you to come over, to be honest. It'd be good. But you've also been working, I know you specialise to some extent, and maybe want to talk a little bit about the work around Chem Sex, for example, which is an area in which you've sort of really I think ploughed a furrow, actually, Stu, and sort of really highlighted the issues in a very positive way, and sort of opened up a dialogue around it. Tell me about what Chem Sex is and what it means and what happens and all that. You mentioned some of them that you used to use yourself, actually. So yeah. Experience.
I mean, Chem Sex is a phenomena that began really back in America in the mid 1990s, and you know, it was actually called party and play culture over there. It still is. And it was really when gay men get together and they're using crystal meth, GHB, and any other. In the original definition of party and play, that could be any party drugs, while, you know, having sex and using dating apps, which back in the 90s didn't exist. Back then it was like, you know, different other platforms. And so, but it was sort of like, that's the basic definition. And then as it's evolved and it sort of came to Australia and more recently hit Europe and England, David Stewart, who was one of the major sort of activists and speakers of Chem Sex in the UK, coined the phrase Chem Sex probably around 2011, 2012, I think. And ever since then, I mean, I guess that's when it really took off over in the UK and when they started having different harm reduction forums over there, and where it's really kind of spiraling out of control at the moment. And, you know, the different negative impacts of that is, you know, people contracting HIV and contracting other sexually transmitted infections, but also, you know, the drug-induced psychosis, different crimes that are associated with that, you know, the terrible come downs, the destroyed relationships, the destroyed family situations. Like the way that this activity sort of can impact all the people around that person as well as that person is quite devastating. So I guess that'd be my summary of Chem Sex.
Right. And it's quite big, I suppose, in the gay male community. And certainly I remember way back when I was a kid, which was a long time ago, and the dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. It was poppers in clubs.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's I would say that it's kind of like, it has so much support and so many services are so aware of it now that while it does still exist, it's sort of like we know how to deal with it now. So all the services are prepared and primed to do that, especially throughout the US, where it's really been an issue for 25 years, which is quite a long time. And, you know, I've been working with Chem Sex clients from, you know, around 2005. So that's now 17 years. Right. And, you know, a lot in my private practice. And, you know, but even still, I mean, that's one of the reasons I do want to come to Europe and start working over there, because I do feel that I have a lot to offer in this area and many, many years experience. And I do get to work on it a bit in Australia, but I more frequently find myself working in these mainstream fields as I am now of general drug addiction and alcoholism. And, you know, I would really love to be able to come to Europe, and, you know, I want to be based in Berlin, where this is a major issue at the moment, and really be able to support a lot of the gay men there that are struggling with it.
So what type, I can guess, but I'd like to hear from you, what are the types of issues that your patient's bringing into you when it is involving Chem Sex and some of the issues, and they may want to moderate or stop? What sort of issues are they bringing into the sort of consulting room?
Well, it depends on like whether they're already in recovery or not, because I will often get referrals from treatment facilities where the person is already 3 or 4 or 5 months sober. And also then it's quite different when someone's coming to see you and they're still in active addiction with Chem Sex. So if I'm working with someone who's further down the track, we're always working on the underlying issues that are driving the need to act out with Chem Sex. So, you know, they can be things like issues with parents. It can be some of them is unprocessed grief. You know, they've had a parent that's died or something that they've never dealt with that, and that's been sort of unconsciously driving their addiction. It can be, you know, struggles with masculinity, you know, not feeling, you know, or that they were bullied, and, you know, so many issues that were not dealt with in the past, or they're struggling with work, or romantic relationships will often play up a big part of that. So, but in a sense, all of those issues are kind of the issues you would get in a generalist counselling profession. So, you know, in some ways at that point, it doesn't matter what the addiction was. You know, what you're dealing with is the challenges that person has in their life, and how to kind of work with them to break through so that those stresses are not going to impact them as much, and therefore lead them to act out with Chem Sex. With the person that's still actively addicted, those issues are quite different. So with them, it's going to be like HIV seroconversion, because, you know, even though we have these medications today that can prevent you getting HIV, it still does happen, for various different reasons. So sometimes it's working with that. Sometimes, more frequently, it's just working with the idea that I am trapped in this. I can't break free from this. The terrible come downs, the being rejected by family because of the stigma of it, or the family are ashamed. For example, it's bad enough my son is gay, but he's also acting out with Chem Sex. And other issues will be drug-induced psychosis is an issue. And depression and anxiety and other mental health issues. There's actually probably as many issues as for the person who's further down the track, but just very different issues.
Much more acute in some ways, much also.
Yeah, more acute.
Because you've got to deal with the messiness of the using, as well as it's more difficult to process things with people if they're sort of coming in, coming down from something, as it were, sort of, or even on it while they're in the consulting room with you. And I imagine in my experiences also there are things that come up from the experience of being exposed during Chem Sex, because there can be some practices that are unpleasant and frightening and difficult. And certainly if you think about GHB and its sort of more sedative effects and some of the more extreme things that people might get themselves involved with in that. And do you come across that as well in terms of trauma and working with trauma reduction and so on? Because I think there's a little bit of a vicious circle there, isn't there, of, people might traumatize themselves and expose themselves and then be self-medicating as well as sort of, trying to manage some of the conditions.
Well, I definitely think so. One of the really common well, not super common, but, that you hear about quite a bit, it actually happens more in the UK than here in Australia that I'm aware of, is, I guess what you would call date rape, or, with GHB is like people or not giving consent, so that, a gay man wakes up and they're being sort of penetrated by someone and they didn't give consent for that. And because they're in such a groggy state, they walk away from that situation, sometimes physically impacted, damaged, that they have to go off and get, help from a professional, but often more so around the guilt and the shame, and like, I know I didn't ask for it, but I don't feel like I can say anything because I was the person that took the drugs. There's also cases where people say that they were actually drugged or given too much GHB. There's a whole series of issues there around consent and rape that are going on and very prevalent. And then the other issues that play out with that is people trying to work out how to take action in those sort of situations and what the greater repercussions of that are. So, for example, family finding out, if your family don't even know you're gay, it's hard to go to the police with that because it's all going to come out. So it's quite layered and complicated, the impact of that. As you were saying with traumatizing, like a lot of people do experience drug-induced psychosis, which is a very terrifying experience. And so when they come out of that, it can be such a relief that you realize that what you were imagining wasn't true. And so, but then you go back into it again and you do, I believe, re-traumatize yourself in a way by re-experience. Like even from my own experience, psychosis was part of my story. I think I must have experienced that 60 or 70 times over a 6-year period. And I just think about, wow, what kind of impact does that have on a person to go through that so many times?
There've been studies now that show that upwards of up to 90% of people with psychosis develop trauma or are trauma-based in some. Trauma is implicated in some way, either from the psychosis or the trauma produces the psychosis. And there's, this stuff at the level that we're talking about, it becomes very, very complex. And actually trying to figure out what started what is probably of not that much use to somebody in terms of just trying to help them overcome the symptoms. And so your plan now is, we're coming towards the end of the show, so that's why I've got us to this point, and what your future plans are. Your plans now are to do a Djokovic from Australia, hopefully not lose your rights to return, but leave your country and come over to Europe and settle in Germany. That's the next step for you, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, so I'm just waiting to hear from the university whether I'm accepted into that master's course in Berlin, and that's to do a master's in social work. And I think I've always wanted to live there for sure, but I've also had a fascination with social work, and I think one of my interest in this area has broadened or peaked recently because my partner is Venezuelan, and I have experienced through his eyes what it's like to be, someone from a country like Venezuela living in a first world country like Germany and not having a bank account, not having health insurance, not having any of the things that I just take for granted in my life. So I would really love to work with LGBTIQ refugee issues and working with especially gay men from countries where you can literally lose your life for being gay or be hanged, which is still prevalent today in 75 countries in the world, which a lot of people don't realize, especially from, first world countries, Western countries. But
and also Germany's refugee profile is exactly those countries. Everybody's refugee profile is those countries, to be honest. But the types of countries it's coming from. So Germany does have a significant refugee population at the moment where these issues are real.
Yeah, and I would love to work in that. I just feel like when I see these, or even through my partners, and see the hardship he goes through, it literally brings me to tears. And I think it's because of how lucky I am. I mean, I think an Australian citizenship is probably one of the most golden tickets you can have in the world. We live in a beautiful country. There's sunshine. We have Medicare. And when, I'm really glad I had this experience with my partner, because I suddenly realized, oh my God, not everywhere in the world is like this. And it's so hard for some people. And I feel that part of my journey is I've had it so good for so long. I want to go and try and make it good for those people, for the time I've got left in my life. Because there's so much heartache and pain and difficulty and so much resistance, so that's definitely why I want to go into social work over there. And probably I don't want to stop working in drug and alcohol. I obviously still want to keep working in Chem Sex over there in Berlin as well. But I wouldn't mind also looking into maybe trans issues a bit too. That would be an area of interest for me as well.
I mean, it's interesting. I identify emotionally with how you're talking. I've always been interested in stuff that happens outside of the consulting room. And so I was a social services manager for 15 years and did the work with refugees and stuff like that. So that's my background. And that was after my qualification, because I never really felt a psychotherapy qualification was enough, to be honest. It seemed that there's more is needed. And I sort of go between both, but I'm very interested in these broader, if you like, systemic issues, I think of them as, and cultural issues and political issues, which I think are present in the work and are an important part of it. And certainly, I think one of the interesting things I learned from refugee work was how when you've been in a situation in which you've been tortured, how do you get meaning back in your life? Well, you have to make meaning of that experience. And often people make meaning of that experience through a political understanding of it. What is the purpose of torture? Well, it's to oppress and control and assert dominance. That's what it's about. And it's to frighten people and control them, and sort of being able to understand it in that context, allowing people to move on from it, and then do the other work that they need to do around sort of the symptoms, etc. So I'm with you. I think that type of dialogue. That's why I like working in multidisciplinary teams, to be honest.
Yeah.
The issues are much broader than one profession, to be honest.
Yes. Yeah. Totally agree with you. That's an interesting point. Every time I think about just going into private practice alone, I feel like, yes, I would really miss out on getting all those different perspectives.
That's why I've made the company that I've got the way it is. It's not me. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and so we have doctors and nurses and stuff like that. And that's what I did in the NHS, And I can't think you can work any other way, really. Which is why I guess I'm a bit cautious of monolithic approaches to addiction, for example. There's only one way. I think that's nonsense. There's never only one way.
No, exactly.
It's also, I think it's the opposite of 12-step philosophy in my book. I mean, step 2 for me was about opening up and learning again, and not shutting down. So it's sort of it seems nonsense to me to suggest there's one way of dealing with it. There isn't. Anyway, lovely to talk to you. Look forward to you coming back. When are you? Do you know when you're heading over? When we get the welcome mat out and the party?
Well, I'm actually coming via New York because I've been asked to run a workshop there at the Gay and Sober event during Gay Pride, which is just a little bonus.
Oh yeah, why not?
So I'm leaving on, hopefully, if all goes to plan, leaving on the 10th of June. And so we'll hope to be in Berlin by the 1st of July.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to sort of maybe catching up with you in Berlin or London when you're over and having a coffee and a chin wag. It's been really, really good to talk to you again. 10 months ago, things didn't look so good. And now things look okay again, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity to come on. I always enjoy talking with you, Noel.
Yeah, same here. It's great to have you on. And you stay with us. I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody else, and then I'll let you go after that. I know you've got to go to work now. You poor soul, after all this nonsense. So I just want to say that's the end of the show for this week. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Great to have Stu with us. And then I'll be back again next week with another live show. So yeah, have a great night and have a great day. Bye-bye, everyone.